Hi, everyone. Welcome to Let's Talk Off the Podium. I have a guest who is making his third appearance on the podcast, and he was in the two club for a while with a couple other people, but now he is number one on the most appearances. George Jackson, welcome.
Hey, nice to see you again. How are you?
Doing well. Thanks for joining me.
Pleasure, absolutely.
It's always fun talking to you. You have so many great stories and an awesome career happening. And one of the reasons we're actually talking is because of a recent event that you participated in. And I want to know all the details because you were involved in a performance during COVID, I should say now. But tell me a little bit about the organization, the orchestra, and start from the very beginning of what it took to even enter the hall for what you did, the recording and the performance.
Yeah, so I started a few years ago as assistant conductor to Daniel Harding at the Orchestre de Paris. Uh-huh. So I'm currently here in Paris, having maintained a relationship with the orchestra since stopped being the assistant with the orchestra. But I was scheduled to do a recording amongst a few other things in this period of time anyway, since sort of 6 months or a year or so. And like everybody out there at the moment, you sort of just start to look at your diary and just think, okay, I think everything's going for the foreseeable future. And then we started having a conversation about a month ago where we had this idea that actually this particular project was always going to be a recording. And of course, the biggest problem right now is how do we get an audience into a concert hall? But actually recording, despite the fact that the kind of recording industry is not as it was in classical music, actually recording is something which can kind of salvage things at the moment in the kind of COVID era. So, we had some conversations. At that point, it was difficult because the border from I live in London. I was based in the UK at this point. This was a month ago, and it was sort of every day there was a different news story coming out about could you travel across a border to work? Is being a musician a key worker? Can you cross a border? Is it too early to be able to do that? And actually, we worked out that it was possible. It was technically allowed to cross the border to work, and so with a lot of careful planning, we started to kind of come up with this idea of making it across the English Channel on the Eurostar to be able to come here and do a week's recording. And so it's now Thursday night, and we've done 4 days of recording sessions with the Orchestre de Paris. So this particular project was primarily an educational project, actually. And so they're opening a new concert hall, the Philharmonie des Enfants, so the Philharmonie for Children, next season. And so they've come up with a couple of kind of interactive educational activities, one of which includes conducting an orchestra. And so, the kids that come to it's a museum essentially, will be able to conduct the orchestra virtually. So our job for the last 4 days was to record 4 different extracts first of all from the Nutcracker and then from Berlioz's Symphonie Fantastique. And the idea is that we record a normal tempo with all the normal dynamics as written. And then we record everybody playing forte, fortissimo, the top end of the dynamic range. And then we record the same piano, pianissimo. And then at the end, we do a very, very painstakingly slow version and then a really fast version. And so the idea is we're working in collaboration with EarCam, the electronic music organization. The idea being that they're able to program these particular recordings that we've made to be able to respond interactively to what the kids are doing. And so I'm not a technical person, so I can't imagine how it's going to be. But it was a lot of fun recording, going through the process of recording, and it was a bit like that moment in The Wizard of Oz where everything's suddenly in Technicolor for the first time. We spent the last 2 months listening to live things online and streams and everything. So to actually suddenly hear an orchestra live and right there in front was really kind of amazing, and it really, I'll never forget. We started actually with the March to the Scaffold, the Berlioz, and just hearing the brass, especially in the big hall of the Philharmonie, was it was, it was a completely unforgettable experience, just because we haven't had that for so long. You really lose that sense of what the sound is. So yeah, it's been a really lovely week, and it's been nice to be here. Although it's raining, but apart from that, it's lovely to be in Paris.
Yeah, and it's sort of raining a little bit here too, and I'm in Seattle. And so getting into the hall or wherever you were recording, what was the process? Did they take your temperature? What was it like getting into the space, recording space, or the hall?
So no temperature at all. And as far as I know, there were no COVID tests or anything in preparation. But we did observe, of course, social distancing measures. Everybody has to have a mask if you're inside a building in France. Whether it's a shop or a workplace, you have to have a mask on. So everyone's walking around the Philharmonie anyway wearing masks inside the building. There's lots of hand sanitizer everywhere, which has been really interesting, because I've noticed that compared to my experience of being in the UK, all the bus stops here in Paris also have hand sanitizer. Wow. So you can just walk down the street and, you just get used to it, and they've really facilitated it very, very well. But going into the hall, everybody would sort of, gather wearing masks. Once you're actually sitting in your place, obviously then you could remove the mask. I was wearing actually not a mask, but of a kind of a headset type hat kind of thing with a plastic visor in front. Although it was certainly more than 2 meters away from the podium, but it was just a sort of extra precaution, because of course conducting with a mask on, our face is an important part of actually conducting, as much as anything else. And of course all the orchestra were 2 meters away within each section. So for example, you would have 2 lines of first violins. And so what was interesting, of course, was the problem of the page turning, because, there's no opportunity to, everybody puts their instrument down and turns the page. So the library were fantastic, and they were able to make sure that any awkward page turns were taken out and things. So it's sort of a practical thing, which nobody, you don't think of until you realize actually that is a problem, because the whole section will stop playing, turn the page, carry on again. So that was fascinating. But it's weird, because actually once we started playing, and once we were in the recording sessions, it was almost like you just forget that this is a big thing that's going on, and actually it's a nice thing, because it's that idea of, whether you're making music in any environment, you do escape from reality a little bit, which is sort of part of the joy of doing it, So yeah, it was almost, you almost forgot for the first time that this epidemic was happening, or pandemic, so to say, happening all over the world. Wow.
And you mentioned the players, and usually for those who, most people obviously listening to this probably are they follow orchestral music, but so the violins and violas and cellos each person had their personal stand.
Yes, exactly. So the way we did it was really fantastically done, actually. So we had the principal of each of the string sections in front of the conductor, weren't actually sitting next to their number 2. So it was always the leader, the principal second violin, almost like a quartet, viola, cello, and then behind them were 2 and 2, but still also separated. So it was just getting used to a different dynamic, and so it was interesting. And actually, I don't know, I of course talked to some of the players as well, and there's always a different sense of playing on your own, away from your section. But I think people, the antennae were up slightly more, listening out for what's going on. And I think, people kind of, we forgot about it actually quite quickly, which is, and we're all musicians are used to doing tours and, ending up in a tiny orchestra pit somewhere and then going to the next concert hall. So I think it's just an extra level of that kind of adaptation, which helps us, So yeah, as I said, you forget about it very quickly, and then you're back to normal again, and then you put the masks on.
Did you have the same amount of players, number of players that you would have if this wasn't happening, or was it less?
No, we consciously for this project, we made sure, for example, with the Berlioz, we made sure we had everybody, Wow. Even with the strings, we had 12 first violins, 10 second violins, all down to 4 basses, so a slightly reduced number of basses. But actually they took the seats of the Philharmonie, of the Pierre Boulez salle, which is the main hall. They took the seats out and spread the orchestra out, and so it was obviously a bigger space throughout the hall. So we were able to fill the space safely within the kind of restrictions. And actually, it sort of just felt like, okay, it was a recording session, but it felt natural. And I mean, yes, the next step, of course, is going to be how do we get an audience into that place? But actually, for a first step back into reality, I think it was a really interesting experience, and I hope part of what the future might be.
Wow. And so you did that, and how long were the rehearsals each day? You've been there for a couple of days. How long were the recordings each day?
Sessions, yeah. So these were 3-hour sessions, so 1 3-hour session each day.
Wow. Okay.
So, yeah,
Yeah,
which
that's
was,
not too bad.
yeah, it was a good rhythm, and I think also because everybody's been off for the last 2 months, so to go back into two. I mean, also for me, I noticed I was like completely knackered after having, we've all been basically idle,
Yeah.
doing not very much for 2.5 months. So yeah, certainly there was a feeling of, okay, it's like the first time you go running after 2 months or after Christmas or something.
Wow. What have you been doing during this time off? I know you've been cooking, so we'll get to that later. But what have you been doing? Physically studying. What have you been doing? What's your day like? What has your day been like? Before getting to these sessions.
Yeah, so I suppose in my mind, there's like almost two phases of what we had in the UK, which was the lockdown.
Mhm.
The first phase was the sort of getting into a routine phase. And then the second phase was about halfway through, and we all, well, at least I speak for myself, but I think it was a shared experience that people started to get a sense of what the future might be all about a little bit. So I found in the first phase, the idea of sort of being involved in anything musical was really difficult, because I think it was almost like a kind of a bereavement of what have we lost here. And actually at that point, the first half of the lockdown, for me, there was a big feeling of, will this ever come back? I think most of the kind of media relating particularly to the performing arts was on the negative side of optimism, let's say. So it was quite difficult to think of the future in that sense. So I found myself actually not engaging that much in what was going on in the performing arts. I watched a lot of like series and films and did a lot of cooking, went for lots of walks, started reading a lot again. At the beginning, I did a bit of studying, but I found myself studying backwards, because as you know, we all sort of have a schedule quite far in advance. And so I thought, okay, well, if I study something that's going to be in 18 months, then there's more of a chance of that happening. So if I work my way back, by the time I get to the things that are happening in a month, they've probably been cancelled, which is basically what happened. Because I find it, I'm not sure about you, but I find it really hard to study something unless I know it's kind of happening.
It is tough. It is tough.
Yeah, I always found that as a student, if you were preparing a symphony in a sort of a lab orchestra type setting, you'd think, okay, actually, I just want to know what I'm going to conduct, and then not have to think about the other movements, although it's a good thing to study everything. So yeah, I did a bit of studying and a little bit of kind of, actually spent a lot of the time on the phone, actually, because it's weird. These days, it's always, as we're doing now, kind of, intense video conversations or quick phone calls or emails. But you don't, as I remember doing as like a teenager, spending like an hour on the phone to someone.
Mm-hmm.
I did a lot of that, which was quite nice. And then about halfway through, I remember starting to talk about some projects that would be happening more towards September, October, so into the autumn. And I remember having a conversation with an orchestra, actually here in France, a different orchestra, who I'm on tour with in September. And we were suddenly having this conversation about which encore we were going to do for a series of concerts. And I just remember thinking, I can't even begin to think of something so abstract, and the idea that might happen. And so that in itself, it must have been sort of early April, I think, probably, or a little bit later, mid-April. Kind of it was like throwing cold water, and suddenly I thought, okay, good, we're something's happening. There's a bit of movement happening in the future. So, and then I was able to start studying a little bit. I started to engage a lot because there'd been some amazing kind of podcasts, obviously your podcast being a fantastic one, but lots of podcasts, lots of video talks with conductors, and actually suddenly you realize that there are some fantastic resources which we're going to have for years to come to kind of rely on as well. So that sort of slowly got me through to the point of June. And I think now it's it's tough. I think there are certain areas of our industry, particularly opera, I think, is difficult because it's an art form that's about lots and lots of people
Yeah.
doing things, close to each other. So that's difficult. But the fact that orchestras are starting to do things, and particularly playing kind of more chamber music type arrangements of things, and socially distanced concerts like that, I think we're in the right direction for it. And I think it's actually forcing people to think in a really creative way,
Yeah.
which isn't a bad thing,
All the European orchestras, or Europe in general, seem to have a bit of a better handle on things than the US, for example. At least that's what it seems like. For example, Seattle Opera here has, from what I understand, canceled their first half of the season
Right.
till January. And New York Phil just recently, I think, announced that they're canceling their season up until January. I'm sure they'll have things happening, but January 6th, I think they'll be back, or around then.
Okay.
So Europe seems like they're actually going to have stuff happening in September, starting September.
Yeah, I suppose the question is how, because we've all had to replan how we do things, and
Uh-huh.
if you think about the number of people that are involved in a single project, or particularly opera, I imagine that's probably a security thing, because the last thing you want to do is rearrange everything and then realize that it was too soon.
Mm.
So I think that it's probably really a wise thing to kind of just go, right, January 2021, that's when things kick off again, and then at least there's a bit of stability and kind of security in starting again. I suppose it's probably a question of funding as well, because I think the way that an orchestra or an arts organization receives its funding probably dictates how it's able to start again, and also where its position is in society,
Yeah.
because I think that's a big difference. I mean, we have a difficult situation in the UK because the government have offered this quite generous furlough scheme. So you can put your employees onto this 80% pay, which the government covers, but in that time they're not allowed to work. So a lot of orchestras, of course, have luckily been able to the government will pay the wages of their members, but of course they can't go back to work until that scheme is over, or at least
Yeah.
then they have to take them off the scheme. So it's quite difficult, really, because once things start opening up, the benefit of that particular government money, you don't get those benefits. I think it's just a question of calculating and seeing. But we're all at different timescales in this. I'm not entirely sure what's going on. I know that there's quite a lot of activity happening in South Korea with orchestras and things at the moment, and I think even some opera happening in South Korea.
Yeah.
Certainly, they're starting to rehearse. Yeah, again, it's just happening later and later. The UK seemed to be about 2 or 3 weeks behind France. Here the bars and restaurants are open, but just for outside seating. So even when I arrived here on Sunday, I just kind of wide-eyed looking at all these restaurants, as if I'd never seen that before. It was an amazing thing. But yeah, I think it's probably quite safe to pick a date that, in the future that you go, okay, right, we're definitely going to be open up by then. And in a way, it's a bit of an improvisation between now and then, really. What can we do because also ultimately, taking aside arguments of economic arguments and all that stuff, we all just miss playing and making music and, being in a family. That I think that's what orchestras and opera houses are very good at, is the feeling of being in a community. And that when that's gone, it's a very difficult situation.
Sort of a personal question, and
Yeah.
I hope that's okay. But I know the arts have been impacted, and artists and people in general who are not even in arts. I have friends in LA who do other jobs, and they've been very impacted by everything happening. How has this impacted your career financially, musically? I mean, not performing for someone who has to either guest conduct or perform or assist other conductors. How has this financially impacted you, and how much is it still going to impact your career and your finances going through the summer and working through the summer?
I think mainly, I mean, I speak very, very personally, but for me, I think the difficulty was that I don't have a fixed position, so I don't have a salaried position or a principal conductor position. So I work on a project by project basis, so when projects get cancelled, they get cancelled and that's the end of it. But actually, a lot of the organisations that I've worked for have been incredibly generous with paying a small cancellation fee. Also, some of them paying the full amount that was agreed in the contract. And so I think a lot of organisations, actually, their sort of generosity personally has helped a lot. I had a situation where I was working on an opera for 2 months, and I'm sure, as you know, mostly with opera you get paid on a performance basis, and we closed just after the opening night. So we did 2 months of rehearsing, and then we did our opening night, and then we stopped. So theoretically, according to the rule of the contract, you get one evening fee and that's the end. So you've essentially done 2 months of rehearsing for free, plus all the expenses that you pay. So this particular opera company very, very generously agreed that actually it's a natural thing to pay the full contract, and that kind of generosity has helped me a lot. And of course, we've all basically just sat down and kind of gone, right, how long can I not have any income for before that becomes a problem? And so I think it's funny with musicians, because I think at the back of every musician's mind there is an element of, okay, when's the day going to come where this isn't happening anymore? And so I think musicians of all the jobs there are very pragmatic. And I think, we sort of suddenly just go, right, how are we going to survive? What can I live off for this amount of time? At what point should I actually start to consider doing other work? At one point I was entertaining the idea of doing some, because I speak German as a second language. So I thought, right, what's the nearest thing to music and to things that I enjoy doing that would be able to give me some sort of security if I did need to change career for a brief period of time. So I did look at, translating and doing sort of German-based stuff in the UK between the two languages. And then, of course, various opportunities started to happen in terms of engagements and things in the future. And so it really, I was very lucky. And I think that also I have to say that the UK government did a very, very interesting scheme where they, for some self-employed, so freelance artists, or in fact freelance any career, you were able to claim a certain amount of your percentage of your profit of per month for about, I think it was a 5-month scheme. Wow. Because of course they know as well that if musicians particularly don't earn any money for 6 months, then their tax bill is going to arrive, in another few months. It's just not going to get paid. Yeah. So it's. I mean, I'm not an economic specialist, but I imagine there's a thing of circulating kind of government money back into the system, yeah, and through it. So but I can speak for myself, and everybody I know I've spoken to, very, very different scenarios all the way through. It's very, very different situations, and it's hard, especially when people know that they have a project that kind of pays most of their bills. Once they go, you have to look around and see what else there is.
Well, I have to ask, because your videos are fascinating. Cooking. Tell me about this. You have you always been into cooking, or is it a recent hobby or a passion?
I have always been, more over the last few years, actually, like 3 or 4 years or so. And I think it's weird, isn't it? Because it's probably something to do with it's a thing that's very, very disciplined, but also very creative, yeah, and it's very tasty. So in a way, there is something very similar to music. Yeah. Music's so funny because practice, scales, metronomes, and all these things. It's a disciplined thing, but also it's creative and it's free and it sounds nice. So there's definitely a relationship between the two. And I know a lot of other musicians who are interested, maybe not in cooking, but in certainly the eating part of that. So that's part of it. But no, for me, it was literally just something to keep a routine going, and I think I did 3 of them a week. So I did these cooking videos where just with my phone, I just recorded, and they weren't supposed to be, look how great this is. It was just really just fun. And I really enjoyed, I got into this routine where I'd finish recording the videos, and then at about 10 o'clock, I'd put on the 10 o'clock news, on the BBC News at home. And while the news was on, I did the editing and started to pick which music to put with the particular film I'd done. And it was for me. It wasn't really for anyone else. I just thought if anyone was interested in what I've been doing, that's what I've been doing.
Wow, that's awesome. Well, I know we initially wanted to talk about your recording project and everything happening, and you are a very positive person. The couple of times we've done this and kept in touch through Twitter and Facebook, you're very positive, and I know you'll have probably lots of positive things to say. But how will this impact the future of music? The pandemic, how is it going to impact negatively the future of music and arts? And I know you'll say lots of positive things, but maybe some negative things. If
I try and be really, really pessimistic, and well, I think, to be honest, I think on a pessimistic side, it's created a kind of existential question in music, because for the first time, a lot of us, I think, have actually started to think, will this exist in the future, or what's the world like without this? I mean, for the first time, we've experienced what the world's like without it. Again, I have to say something positive, but I'd like to think that we've all experienced the world without the arts and live performing arts, and it's not very nice. So, I mean, it can only be a good thing that we appreciate it more in the future. I think the problem is probably, again, going back to kind of the economy in some way. If it's sort of about supply and demand, and about how much disposable income is there for people to go and see things, go to concerts, renew their subscriptions to a symphony orchestra, go to the opera. Do people have that spare cash to be able to do those kinds of things? That's the thing that scares me, because of course the first stage, which is a short-term problem, is ensuring the kind of immediate survival of our arts organizations, but actually it's about the kind of concert going culture, because like any recession or any economic difficulty, people tighten their belts and they don't have the same money to spend on these kinds of things. We're not in an industry that's based upon enormous margins, at the best of times. It's people break even. That's a great thing if no one's losing out by doing it. So in a way, though, again, to continue to be positive, the question that we've all been asking ourselves is, how do we justify and prove the argument that we need music in all its different forms, and especially when it's live music? And because of course the answer to the question is, do we need music? If the answer is no, then that's the end of orchestras and opera houses and we can go home. But that's the point. We all think that we do, and we have to make a stronger argument why we do. And I think that's not the worst thing to have to do. Why not at least, and we've talked, I think, before on this podcast about the challenges. Let's take the C word out of the equation, but actually what are the challenges of what we have to do? We have things like, we have an aging audience, we have difficulties in music education. They're things that have to be solved anyway, but in a way they'll be solved as we're redefining what it is that we do. And so in a sense, it's like pressing the reset button and just changing things, hopefully for the better, and actually, in a way, what's interesting now about this whole kind of restructure is that it's going to be the younger members of the sort of generations of musicians that are going to be responsible for that, which is quite an exciting thing. It's a big change. And the message is, okay, what do we do to prove that this is something that we all need? And I think that's not the worst argument to try and win.
Yeah. And the aging audience, this has been talked about for decades, from what I understand, even before our generation. And some say, the aging audience, it'll always be that way because it's just like fine wine. The people get older and really start to appreciate what classical music is about. But again, it comes to the point, and with younger people, how can we get younger people interested and passionate about classical music early on, instead of wait for them to get to 50, 60, 70, 80 and then say, okay, well, there's something interesting about this field. What can we do as artists? And I know this is a big question, but I do like asking these big general questions, so we can talk about it, or you could bring some ideas that we didn't think about. Any thoughts on what we could do as artists to get the younger generation excited about what we do?
Well, it's interesting because part of my kind of crazy reading that I did over the last 2.5 months, I read this interesting, it was a kind of philosophy thing about aesthetics and the history of aesthetics as a discipline. And one of the things I noticed about, they were talking a lot about aesthetics in theatre and in opera and also in symphonic concerts as well. What was interesting is that our industry, or at least our art form, works on kind of two levels of aesthetics. You've got the aesthetic of the piece itself. You know, oh, I love Mozart Symphony Number 40, so I'd like to hear that. But you also have the aesthetic of the experience of something. In our case, it's the going to the concert hall. It's, you know, going for a large gin and tonic before the concert, and then maybe going for dinner afterwards. You know, it's that which is another aesthetic thing which surrounds the actual aesthetic of the music. So I think that although it's important to focus on how great is this piece of music, I think the way to attract a younger audience is to say to them, actually, this is something, an experience to have, and an experience to engage in, which I think is probably the way through it, because I think people are intimidated by maybe the complexity of classical music, you know, in classical music in that sense, which I understand. But actually, the experience is very simple. It's a night out. It's a nice evening. I think live performance of anything is always going to be exciting. I think that the difficulty with, or the danger with, the live streaming culture and the sort of online, you know, looking at the arts in that way, is that it's the experience that you lose. You know, and I think we've all had that feeling that actually, I love, you know, whether it's theatre or opera, you know, in London where I live, you know, going into town, having a drink, going into the show, you know, then maybe going out afterwards or having dinner at some point, and in itself, it's an experience. And it's a bit like if you look at sports, you know, yes, it's about going to watch football or soccer, as we say, but actually it's more than that. It's the experience of actually doing that. And so in a way, I think the more we focus on the experience of what a live classical music event is, the more successful we'll be at bringing in different audiences, because actually it's the concert format that is the thing that will attract people into the hall in the first place.
Yeah. Well, with football, soccer, whatever you want to call it, or any sporting event, you know, the phone component, which happens to be so important nowadays. I've been talking to some of my, you know, I conduct some youth orchestras, and for them, the phone is such a big part. And I've realized, even for me, the phone has become such a big part of my life that in classical concerts, you take that out a little bit, because in a sporting event, you're able to, you know, video or just be on your phone for a little bit and get away from that. In the classical music setting, for the most part, you can't really be on your phone, right? So that I don't know what the solution is to that, because I still feel like people should have the experience. As you said, an experience is a great word, because even if you don't understand something, just being there in the moment and really experiencing what the sound is like, what it is you're hearing and feeling, and just watching something, even if you don't understand it. I've always, maybe it's the way I grew up or just the experiences I've had in my life, but being in a space where, even if it's foreign to me, I just like being in that moment and experiencing the sounds that I don't understand, or even if it's a language thing. So many times I've been in a space where I didn't understand the language, but just being in that experience and watching people interact, even if you don't understand the language, it's sort of a great experience, especially for me. But I understand it might not be the case for many people. So the phone component, and also intermission. If you have some thoughts about intermissions, because I know some people are experimented. The Seattle Symphony has done it with just an hour concert, no intermission. It has worked for some people. I know some friends who really enjoy that. And also the phone component. Is there a way we could bring in the phone into the concert hall?
Well, I think it's interesting, because to go back to my strange aesthetics thing, I suppose people would say that you shouldn't be on your phone or you shouldn't talk, because that just detracts away from focusing on the work that you're looking at. But actually, again, why is that not a problem in a sports situation? You know, that's I don't think that is a problem, you know, as far as I know. So yeah, and I know that actually a lot of orchestras have done sort of like sort of program notes. In fact, I went to a concert last year, which was Pierre Lunaire, the Schoenberg,
Uh-huh.
and you had to go on Twitter to get the text which they tweeted as you were going through the show, which was great because they were singing in the original German, and you have the English text being tweeted. Like you could follow the account of the ensemble, and that was there. Why not? I mean, do we need to print programs all the time? And that's a whole other argument. But I think with the phone thing, yeah, okay, you don't want to distract other people from their enjoyment. And in that sense, I understand that it is a difficult thing to try and change. But at the same time, yeah, if you keep it like a holy kind of work of art, museum, librarian, those old librarians who tell you to be quiet all the time. I don't think it needs to be like that. I think it's again, it's not a museum. We're not there with the honor of witnessing a work of art. It's happening live in front of our eyes.
Yeah.
So I think the phone thing, perhaps it's probably to do with attention span. It's like having a conversation with somebody, and if you're on your phone, it sends a message that you're not interested perhaps in the conversation. So I understand that, but I think, and it does relate to the idea of the intermission that you talk about, because we're conditioned to have an attention span for a certain amount of time. So for example, films or movies, an hour and a half, 2 hours, anything more than that, we're not used to that rhythm of the attention span. We're used to a format of TV that's 25-minute episodes or 45-minute episodes with advert breaks in between. I think we're used to a shorter kind of bite-sized format of a lot of activities. And of course, even something like Twitter, you've got however many characters in the tweet, and so we're condensing things. So I like the idea of a concert that's just a 45-minute symphony, and that's it. No, an early, I think they call them rush hour concerts in the States. I know that the London Symphony Orchestra do a series called Half Six Fix, I think it's called. So it's slightly earlier than a normal concert, an hour or so. The idea that you can then go and have dinner, but that's to do with this thing we're talking about of experience. Mm-hmm. We're actually, as much as and it's for conductors too, as much as we're people that have to make sure that the woodwinds are playing forte and that's happening not too late and everything, we're also people that have to think about the idea of how should this music be experienced, and I think I like the idea of a concert that's just a 45-minute symphony. I don't see why that is an enormous problem. But also at the same time, there is something really special about a beautifully crafted evening of a program, where you have an overture that fits in with a nice symphony, with a concerto that, especially when it's about long range tonality and, when you have, the feeling that you've been in the same key for the whole evening, which you sometimes get with programs. So I think we just need to be kind of flexible with it, and also accept, if you look back at those, those famous Beethoven concerts, when he would hire out theatres and concert halls and he'd put on these, 5 or 6 hour marathons.
I was just going to say that. I was just going to say that, there are friends, and probably they don't want their names mentioned on record, but I've talked to people who have said, well, we can't keep bending over and trying to please all these people. We should have a concert that's, 2.5 hours long or something, and we should do this, and we shouldn't keep trying to please everyone. Just do it the way we've done it for a long time, and that seems to happen. But if we were to do that, we should do a concert like Beethoven that's 5 hours long.
Yeah, exactly. But then in a way, that's the challenge of the whole thing about what we do, because in a way, in one sense, we do the most traditional, historical, potentially conservative thing, with wearing, the kinds of clothes that you'd never wear in the 21st century. At the same time, we're also looking to innovate and to speak to the time that we're in. So that's part of what we do. We have to be able to kind of look forward and look back at the same time. So I think let's not get rid of the traditional idea of a concert, but let's augment it with the idea that we could potentially, because also as well, those younger audience members will age, and then maybe they will want to come to the concert that's longer. And the thing is that the problem is that everybody judges things on a very short-term basis. And the thing is, we want to see results, in 5 years. Let's start a music education program. And then in 5 years, everything will be solved. But no, it's a multi-generational thing of change. And so, if you're doing something that you think is good for a community, don't stop doing it because there are no short-term results. It's going to take look at the Leonard Bernstein Young People's Concerts. They're resounding now.
Yeah.
However many years later, 50, 60 years later, because of people that sat in those concerts or saw those concerts and became musicians or subscribed to their symphony. So we really need to kind of think of that long-term kind of vision as well, which is really hard to do, because also we want quick returns and quick results with everything quickly. That's a different world.
And 5 years, you're being too generous.
I'm being too generous,
people program things, people implement things, and then 6 months later they're like, well, this is not working. You have to have some patience. Being in the classical music world, you would think that some people have the patience, because if you have the patience to go through years and years of playing your violin or whatever instrument you're playing, and have the patience to sit in rehearsals for hours and hours and work on detailed little passages and scales and all the things that you have to do to get to that level, but then you don't have the patience for like a 5-10 generational project where people will benefit from. It's kind of frustrating at times, but we do live in a world where things have to get done fast, and we have to make this change nice and quick, and it has to happen now, and it doesn't always work. It's tough, but Leonard Bernstein is truly an inspirational figure. I love what he does, and I just wish there were more Leonard Bernsteins, or people who had a similar approach, not more of him, but just people who really cared about the community, the youth. One thing that sometimes, and it's a tough topic to talk about because I have friends and mentors and colleagues who do this, but I just wish some of the music directors were a little bit more involved in their orchestras and the community outreach and the youth projects and all these things. But now we live in a world where things are going by fast. You have to, you do your subscription concert, you have to fly out to do another guest conducting thing. And I just, just having someone who represents the orchestra it's sort of not there. Are there figures who you think are doing that? And nowadays, like Bernstein did, I think a lot more than many of the other conductors do now.
I think what's interesting is that we tend to place a lot of emphasis on the conductor or the music director as sort of responsible for that. And of course they are the figurehead of an organization publicly and everything. But my experience of having done a lot of education projects with various different orchestras, there is always, most of the time, there is an incredibly amazing person whose job is to be responsible for education concerts, who doesn't necessarily have a very public kind of image or isn't a public face, but is doing an amazing amount of incredible work kind of behind the scenes in programming and planning, and in sort of cultivating these things. So I think that, it's true that, the culture of flying around to conduct will probably stop, as it has been anyway. So that's a byproduct of this particular crisis, I suppose. But actually, I think there are organizations have fantastic people in them who do that job of education and who do that job of cultivating. Because actually, I think with the job of music director, it's like if you said, okay, what does a conductor do? The list is endless, and they can't do everything.
Yeah.
It's impossible to do everything. I think certain sized orchestras, there's definitely perhaps more scope for somebody who's more involved in the community. But at the same time, I think the other thing that's interesting is that with the international world of music, sometimes, because I've found that I've really enjoyed working, particularly in France, but also in Italy and Austria. And I've found that actually being somebody who's outside the culture you're working in also has its benefits. Mm-hmm. Because sometimes, if you're in your culture, if you know your culture very well, you almost can't really see past that.
Yeah.
Whereas I've had lots of situations where I've come into a different country or a different city at least, and kind of you have an overview of it, and actually you look at little tweaks or how things could be changed or what's working really well. You take them with you to the next place, or and so in some way the value of a music director who does sort of fly in and out probably doesn't present itself immediately, but it is also a very good thing, because that sort of internationalization, that sort of international element of it is really important. I know what you mean, though. It's a shame that somebody who represents the community maybe doesn't know the community.
Yeah.
I get that as well.
No, I understand your point. I do understand your point, but also, and I know maybe it's not a good comparison, but it's like, a coach for a soccer team or something. Imagine he was coaching a couple of teams. I understand guest appearances, but it's just, I don't know. I have mixed feelings, but I do love your ideas and your point of view on this. It's great to, and that's why I enjoy talking to you. So many great points. But I can't even believe we're like 45 minutes into our conversation. I do want to know, because you've been very busy, active. What's next for you? Not just what's next, literally, as in your next project, but what do you want to do next? I mean, you want to be a music director of an organization? What's your plan? What's in the back of your mind you want to do for the future for yourself?
I think it's very difficult to define kind of what, something concrete that I'd like to do. To be honest, I think what I really enjoy doing is being able to be quite flexible with the type of work I do. So I do a lot of opera, but I try and restrict myself to 1, maybe 2 operas a year, because I think opera is like an enormous undertaking, especially if it's a new production, collaboration with the director, plus the singers, plus the orchestra, plus everything else. And so, I love it, but I also want to dedicate the right amount of time to doing it. So I tend to do new productions if I can, which involves 2 months of being in the same place, and then the performances. So that's sort of a quarter of your year spent just doing one opera. So I try to keep that. I'd like to keep that going in that kind of rhythm. Again, I love contemporary music. I love working with living composers. I really enjoy the sort of challenge of kind of a score that you've got no particular reference to when there's no recording, for example, and the idea of actually, you almost have to go more into the creative side of a composer and get into a sound world that's new. And so I try to keep that going as well. And then, of course, there's the kind of traditional repertoire, and working with great orchestras doing that kind of repertoire as well. So I think for me, it's about the variety. I'm very conscious of the fact that, for various reasons, we like to get put in boxes of what we do. That the early music conductor, the guy that does, certain contemporary repertoire, and I don't know. I find the variety of it, and actually some of the great conductors, someone like Harlan Court, for example, Nicholas Harlan Court, he brought something amazing to so many different areas of repertoire that, in a way, that's really exciting. That things like Porgy and Bess, and I think Meistersinger at one point, and just this huge variety of repertoire that you wouldn't expect. And so that, I think, is really exciting. And of course, people have things to say about so many different genres of music. It doesn't have to be what they think their specialization is.
And you mentioned Harlan Court. It's really interesting. The past about four or five conductors I've had, I think they've all mentioned him. It's really interesting. And I had Jaime Martin, who was on my podcast. He's a conductor, and he's actually, I think, currently in London.
Yes.
And he talked about him and how he was a mentor for him, and it's really interesting. He's somehow, I kind of want to compare him to like a Kleiber figure, where I feel like there's some kind of a cult following for Harlan Court. I don't know, maybe that's the wrong description, but it's like Kleiber or I don't know, Celibidache or Bernstein. There's some kind of a cult following for Harlan Court. Do you get that feeling? Or
yeah, I think for me, the relationship with Harlan Court is a bit different, because I studied in Vienna at the time when, at the very last phase of his life. So I was in Vienna from 2009 until 2014. And so at that time, he was very active, both with the Philharmonic, but also with his Concentus Musicus, his ensemble. So I used to go to a lot of concerts, and there'd be a Haydn symphony, and particularly around Easter, there'd be a lot of Bach, passions and things going on. So yeah, it's interesting, because I also noticed at the time I studied in Vienna, I was also doing quite a lot in the States. So I did some master classes, and I attended Aspen Music Festival, for example. And I got to, as I got to know a lot of American colleagues or American trained colleagues, I realized that the sort of 2 or 3 conductors that people in America almost didn't have on their radar was Harlan Court, Christian Telemann a little bit, and these are conductors who are in Europe the top, like they're the most important kind of figures, but then they hadn't kind of registered on the American side of things.
That's weird, because for me, both those names have registered, and I know those names really well, and their work. So,
but it might be quite recent now.
Yeah.
Because this was about 5 or 6 years ago, certainly, and I don't really know if they ever work with the American orchestras or companies. I'm not sure, but certainly Harlan Court, I mean, he was such an important figure in Vienna, especially. But also, in a way, he sort of did things his way. He had his ensemble. He worked out primarily as a musicologist as well, and he wrote a lot about particularly rhetoric in music, and how his particular ideas about the kind of speech rhythms and things behind a lot of the 18th century repertoire. It was, you couldn't avoid the kind of Harlan Court school of thought as a student in Vienna. It was just, and I remember once at one point having to choose between going to a kind of lecture on, I don't know what it was on, and going to see a rehearsal of Harlan Court. And of course I went to the rehearsal because it was much more interesting, and I learned a lot more, I think. But so that's an interesting that, there's a little bit of, but now actually everything's getting, we're all a bit more global with who's busy and who's doing what, and, despite the difference in recordings and things now.
And Gergiev is another figure who I feel like is very active in Europe and Russia, of course, but I don't think I've, other than the tours that he's done with his orchestra, where he's come to the States, I don't think he works with the orchestras in the States, does he? I mean, I don't think I've noticed that.
I know that the Metropolitan Opera is quite a regular place, but I think it's very interesting, isn't it? Because I think in a way actually there aren't that many conductors that, because it's you're not just talking about repertoire, but you're talking about different cultures of making music. And there aren't that many conductors that have successfully kind of navigated through all of those different systems. Someone I've always really admired, actually 2 conductors I really admire for that reason, is David Robertson and Donald Runnicles. Because I remember both of them. I mean, David Robertson certainly was BBC Symphony Orchestra while St. Louis, while Sydney, that, which is 3 continents of being involved with orchestras. Don Runnicles the same with his relationship with Atlanta and in Deutsche Oper in Berlin, as well as the BBC Scottish. So I've got huge admiration for the conductors because it's actually, and I remember actually we studied with David Robertson at one point, and he talked a lot about the psychology of how so much of our job is about understanding psychology and relating to lots of people who kind of want different things at different times, but it's just fundamentally a human thing. And actually, clearly, understanding those different cultures of making music is a really, really fascinating thing. And I mean, in a way, that's one of the lovely things about guest conducting in different countries, is that you really, really get to know France when you work with the French orchestra, or wherever it might be. And that's a great way of, it's not just turning up and having moule frite, and that's it. It's actually really, really getting into the culture, and it's a lovely way to do it.
Hey, George, we could talk about music forever. I can't even believe, but now it's close to an hour. We'll call. Did you have anything else to add before we end?
No, it's just lovely to reconnect and catch up.
Yeah, this is awesome. Thank you so much for joining me, and hopefully the 4th time, well, maybe we'll do it in via Zoom or Skype again, but hopefully one day we actually meet in person.
So, that would be great. Yeah, I'm sure that will happen, and it will be we'll talk for much more than an hour.
Well, take care, and I'll see you soon. Thank you for joining.
Thanks very much. Take care.
Thanks for listening to Let's Talk Off the Podium. If you enjoyed this episode, please comment, share, and subscribe. Stay tuned for the next episode.